How y'all doing this morning? Now, Brian says he usually gets y'all to stand up when he reads scripture, but today we're going to be going through probably 4 or 5 chapters. So I'm going to ask y'all to stay seated. I'm going to come down to y'all's level since I think the podium was designed for this anyway. Did y'all get this out of children's church? Yeah, okay. Don't quit laughing. How many of y'all grew up in the video arcade game era? If you're like your mid-30s to above that, so you know what I'm talking about. We got some video arcade people. I grew up before the days, I know it's hard to imagine some of the kids now, we used to not have entertainment systems in our house, but we actually went to the arcade. And so when I was a kid, that was one of the things that I looked forward to. And our summer vacation, we would go to a place called Lakewood Campground. Anybody been to Lakewood Campground? We've got a few. And I would go, as soon as we got there, I would hijack the family golf cart. I would elude the security officers there in the campground and make my way down to the arcade. Now, all year long, I would save up. Any quarters I found in the ashtray of our car, anytime I found money, I would save it up. And then as soon as I got to the beach, I would proceed to blow it all. It didn't matter how much I'd saved. I was going to go straight to that arcade. I was going to stay there the entire week. I didn't care about the beach. I wanted to play video games. Well, back in 1984, they introduced a new game. Nintendo did, not a little small game, but an arcade-sized game. And that was the game called Punch-Out. How many of you remember the game Punch-Out? A couple folks remember Punch-Out. Basically, the premise of it was this. You would go up against these other boxers, guys with the names of Glass Joe, Piston Hurricane. There was a guy named Pizza Pasta. But the guy that always seemed to get me was a guy called Bald Bull. I would go into the arcade and I would start putting quarters in there. I would line my quarters across the top of the game. Anybody remember doing that? That was kind of let the other kids in line know you're going to be there a while. Don't even try to cut. You got all these quarters lined up. I'm next. I'm going to keep playing. And so every time, though, playing Punch-Out, I would come up against this guy called Bald Bull. And Bald Bull had this move that he would do. He would back up. And then he would go towards you. He would do like a 3-bounce hop. And then his eyes would turn yellow. And he would go, whoom. And you would go down to the mat every single time. Well, of course, when you get knocked down, there's this little voice on the game going, come on, get up. You know, and it would whisper to you. But after you got knocked down 3 times, though, that was it. You had to put in another quarter. And so there I went. The entire week I was there. I would get through Glass Joe. I would get through Piston Hurricane. I would get through all these other characters, and I would make it to Bald Bull. And he would do his little bounce, and down I would go. I was knocked down repeatedly. But every single time, I would pop in another quarter, and my dude would pop back up, and I was ready to go again. Well, this morning, what we're going to take a look at is we're going to take a look at a guy over in the book of Genesis who was knocked down repeatedly by life. And I think each one of us, there's probably different areas in our life where we would say that there's been moments where we've experienced those knockdowns. There's been times in our life where we've been blindsided. When Bald Bull has just took us to the mat and we're left laying there wondering, should I just go ahead and get up or should I just throw in the towel? I heard an old preacher one time, he kind of said it like this. He said, you know, all of us are going to face setbacks. And he had kind of a raspy voice, and he was spitting when he talked. I'm not going to spit for the sake of you guys on the front row. I didn't give out, like, raincoats for you to wear. But he would sit there, and he was spitting, and he had this raspy voice, and he said, you know, all of us are going to face setbacks. He said, your setbacks will do one of 2 things. They'll cause you to sit back or to allow God to prepare you for a comeback. And I always loved that, especially when he spit stuff. That was cool. But I thought about that, and I never forgot what he said that day. You see, that's true in life. Whenever we face setbacks in life, we've got 1 or 2 choices of how we can react to that setback. We can sit back. We can throw in the towel. We can give up hope. We can cash it in and say, you know what, I'm out. Or we can begin to look around and say, God, how are you preparing me for a comeback? You see, we face setbacks in many different forms and fashions. We face setbacks when it comes to our job. Maybe you've walked into work in the past few years, or sometime maybe when the economy crashed and you walked into work and your boss said, you know what, sales are just not what they should be in your area. We're going to have to make some cutbacks. We're going to have to begin to let some people go. Maybe you were laid off, or maybe you had your salary reduced. Maybe you've been hunting for a job for a long time, and the situation you've been going through has kind of knocked you to the ground, and you're looking around and you're thinking, what's going on? Why is this happening to me? And you've been knocked to the mat. And you have a choice you can make. You can sit back and say, you know what, I give up. I'm tired of trying. I've done everything I'm supposed to do, that this isn't working out. So you see, we face setbacks when it comes to our job. We face setbacks when it comes to our family. Maybe there's some family relationships that have kind of gone haywire. You know, everybody likes to talk about they hate the holidays because you have to get together with all of your crazy family members. Maybe for you, every week is like Christmas. You know, you have constant drama going on. There's that brother, that cousin, that sister. There's something just not happening right when it comes to your family. And you're facing a setback in regards to your family. Maybe it's something that's going on with your children, or maybe something's happening with your parents and you face setbacks. You see, we've all faced setbacks. It could be in regards to your health. Maybe you've faced a setback. You've walked into the doctor's office and you've heard news that you did not want to hear, and out of the blue, you find yourself laying on the mat thinking, what just happened? You've been knocked down. I can remember back when Isaac was first born, you know, it was 16 years ago, but we had just had him, and about 3 weeks in, doctor walks into the room and boom, we were knocked to the mat. Your son has a disease. It's nothing that you want to hear. Maybe it's a family member, nothing that you want to see happen, but suddenly you find yourself going, you know what, I've done all the right things. I've done what I thought I was supposed to do, but suddenly I find myself laying on the mat, and at that point in time, we've all got to make that decision. Am I going to sit back, or am I going to allow God to prepare me for a comeback? So if you would this morning, turn with me over to Genesis 37. And like I said, remain seated because we're going to go through about 4 chapters this morning. So you'd be standing up the whole time. And I imagine you would get tired. Genesis chapter 37, this morning we're going to be looking at a guy by the name of Joseph. And it starts off in verse 37. We are introduced to his father Jacob. It said, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. He's also known as Israel. So when you hear that in just a minute. It said, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers and the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wife. And he brought their father a bad report about them. So here we're introduced to Joseph right off the bat, and we see that he's out with his brothers. And so what does Joseph do? He goes back and he tattletales on the rest of his brothers. It's kind of like that person, you remember when you were in the 5th grade and you had that one person that always wanted to be the classroom monitor, the person that wanted to write down everybody's names, and if you talked, they were writing it down. They couldn't wait to tell. Brian Holder was probably a classroom monitor. Y'all have those at private school. You only had 2 people in your class. He only had to tell on one other person. But that person, you know, the the hallway monitor, that person that watches to see if people are running down the hall, everybody had a Dwight Schrute in their class. You know, the guy in the classroom, maybe somebody at your work. They're always looking to see what everybody else is doing right, and they're going to tell somebody about it. That's what we see Joseph doing right here in chapter 37. It says, this is the account of Joseph. He went and he brought their father a bad report about him. See, that's not a good way to get in good standing with your siblings, you know, being the tattletale of the family. And so it continues on in verse 3. It says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Now, right off the bat, we see that his father loved him more than the rest of his sons. Some of y'all have siblings, and how many of y'all have siblings that you believe your parents love more than everyone else? Jamie, who's the favorite in your family? I don't even have to guess. I'm going to say Brandon, right? Is that right? Okay. Yeah. Anybody else have siblings that you think, you know what, they are the favorite? Gabe, who would you say is the favorite? Zeke. Is that true? Y'all can beat him. Y'all can beat him when y'all get home. Just, hey, y'all, Gabe's going to disappear for a few days. Y'all need to check on him, his welfare. But anyway, We've all seen that. You know, everybody thinks that the other's the favorite and stuff. Your parents all love you the same. Yeah, right. Anyways, but in this case, Joseph had done nothing wrong. He had done nothing wrong. There wasn't anything that he can control about the fact that he was his father's favorite. But it continues on right here. It says, Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him a richly ornamented robe. He made him a richly ornamented robe. A lot of times when we hear the story about Joseph, we hear it as the coat of many colors. You've probably heard that before. But he made him this richly ornamented coat. Now, it had some significance, and the significance of the coat that his father had given him was of this. First of all, a richly ornamented robe was something that would have been worn by someone who was not considered to be of the working class. This would have been someone who didn't really get out and have to do any manual labor, because it would have been longer than one of the regular cloaks that somebody who was out, say, tending sheep or something like that would have worn. And it also had a longer sleeve. You wouldn't have wanted to get that dirty. But the more significant thing about that robe was this. When someone gave someone a robe like this, particularly when a father gave a son a robe like this, it indicated that that son had a special birthright. Now, traditionally, in that time and place, the special birthright, or the double portion of the inheritance, was reserved for the son that was the oldest. Joseph was not the oldest son, but yet his father was giving him this special birthright. And so, of course, you can imagine this did nothing to kind of help out his brother's feelings about Joseph. And so it says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So here we see the situation. Joseph is the favorite of his father. His brothers hate him. And then what Joseph does next doesn't really endear himself to his brothers, because it tells us that one night Joseph had a couple different, or he had a couple different dreams, a couple different nights. But the first dream he had was this. He said, you know what? I had this dream. He goes in, and the mistake he makes is he goes in and he tells his brothers about it. He said, there was these sheaves of grain, and all of your sheaves of grain, they bowed down to me. And so his brothers hated him all the more. What, are you saying that we're going to bow down to you one day? And then he has another dream, and he comes back to his brothers again, and he says, you know what? You guys are going to bow down to me. So we see a little bit of arrogance, maybe a little bit of naivety, but also a little bit of arrogance in the life of Joseph right here. And so it says down in verse 11, it says, his brothers were jealous of him. They hated him. They hated him. They were jealous. They hated him. And so one day his father sends him off to check on his brothers. He sends them out to the fields, and then we pick up the story down in verse 17. It says, they have moved from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers. Again, he's doing simply what his father had asked him to do. He's being obedient to his father. He's going out to check on his brothers, and says, so Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, one of these wells. Now, we've all had, if you've had a sibling before, you've all had moments where, you know, you thought, you know what, they worn your favorite shirt, and you thought, I could just kill them, you know. Or maybe they wrote in your annual, like they scribbled on the, like my sister did, and you thought, you said, you know, I could just kill them for that. But you really didn't mean it, because when worse comes to worse, you really probably love your sibling, or at least you act like it during Christmas time, so your parents will give you good presents. But Joseph's brothers literally hated him. They really wanted to kill him, and we see it right here. They begin to plot how they could get rid of their brother. And so they have this whole debate going back and forth. Should we kill him? And then one brother's arguing and say, no, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in a well, and then we can sell him, which sounds like a little bit better plan. You know, why kill your brother when you can sell them to get money? And so what do? It says right there that that's what they did. So Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So that when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, and they sold him for 20 shekels of silver. 20 shekels of silver. Now, some of you that are sitting there thinking, I have 4 or 5 brothers and sisters. I could have made a lot of money back in the day. They sold their brother. And so here Joseph is. He had simply been doing what it was that his father had told him to do. And he finds himself knocked down. He's facing a setback. Not only had his brothers thrown him into a well, they had threatened to kill him, but suddenly he finds himself being sold into slavery. Something totally unexpected. It hit him out of the blue, and suddenly he finds himself with a setback. And things got worse for Joseph right there. It says, meanwhile, over in verse 36, it says, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. You see, things began to take a turn for the worse. For not only had he been sold into slavery, but now he had been sold to the Egyptians, a place that he did not know the language, he did not know the culture, and he wasn't free to come and go as he pleased. You see, he had faced a setback in his life. And your setbacks, they can cause you to sit back, or they can cause you to look to God to begin to prepare you for a comeback. Over in chapter 39, we're going to pick up the story of Joseph, and it says, in chapter 39, verse 1, it says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So here we catch up with Joseph. He's had a setback in life. He had been knocked down. And here he is in slavery, and he's been sold to a guy by the name of Potiphar. Now, it says that Potiphar was the captain of the guard. Basically, what that meant was Potiphar was like the head of the secret service, those people that had been assigned to be the closest to Pharaoh. He had a lot of trust from Pharaoh. He was one of his right-hand men. He was protecting Pharaoh's life. And so Joseph has been sold to Potiphar, but now notice what happens. In spite of the difficulty that Joseph was facing, in spite of the fact that he had been knocked down, this trial that he was going through, something that he would not have planned for himself, because I imagine if Joseph kind of laid out his life plan, and we all kind of do that in our ideal world, we think, you know what, this is what life's going to look like. It's all going to be smooth sailing. Everything's going to go well. I'm going to win the lottery one day. I'm going to move to Florida and have lots of, how many of y'all dream about winning the lottery? I mean, it's kind of hard when I ain't never bought a ticket, but, I think about it sometimes. I think, if somebody lost a ticket and I picked it up, that would be great. And so we have this fantasy in our mind. You hear about the guy that picked up one out of a Burger King trash can or something. He won millions of dollars. And I think in my mind, in a perfect world, this is how things would look. And I imagine in Joseph's wildest dreams, he never thought, you know what, here I'm going to be living in slavery in Egypt. This is going to be awesome. But it says right here that he's living in slavery under a guy by the name of Potiphar. But check out what happens in verse 2. It says, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes. I think it's important to note that right there, even though he was in the midst of a trial, even though he was in the midst of a difficult circumstance, God had not forsaken him. I think that many times in life, if we were honest with ourselves, when something knocks us to the ground, something unexpected that we weren't counting on, when it happens, if we're all honest, I believe that many of us would look up and we say, why, God, why is this happening to me? I've done everything that you've asked me to do. I go to church, I volunteer in my community, I give to the church, I help out people, but yet why is this happening to me? Why did this happen to my family member? Why is the relationship I'm in going through this turmoil? Why does my boss keep doing this to me? God, I'm doing everything you've asked me to do. Why do I get knocked down? And a lot of times, if we're honest, we kind of think that, God's kind of abandoned us. If we were completely gut honest, a lot of times we think that. But yet, in Joseph's life, God had not abandoned him. In verse 2, it says that the Lord was with him. And then in verse 3, it says, when Pharaoh saw that the Lord was with him. You see, even in the midst of the trying situation that he was in, God was preparing him. He had a choice to make. He could have thrown in the towel. He could have given up at that moment. Or he could have begun to look to God to allow him to prepare him for something greater. You see, the greatness that God prepares us for in our life is so that his glory can be seen in and through our lives. You may not ever lead a company, you may not ever lead a nation, but the ultimate goal of what God wants for our lives is so that his glory can be displayed through our lives. It's something greater. You see, as parents, we all want something greater for our children, right, Todd? Todd's got 3 girls. You want something greater for your child. You know, as parents, I think we all would say, you know, one of the greatest things is we want our child to move out, right? You know, no parent wants to wake up and look in their basement and realize they've got a 45-year-old son playing video games in the basement in his pajamas. You know, we want something greater for them. We have high expectations and hopes for them. So what do? We try to prepare them for life, right? You know, there's these minor victories that we prepare them for. We begin at an early age. And I can remember when our son was really little, there was 2 really big things that I was looking forward to as a parent. Number 1 was that he would feed himself. That is a glorious day when you don't have to sit at the restaurant and scoop up, you know, squished peas off of their chin and shove them back into their mouth for the 5th time because they keep spitting them out. The day that they pick up a spoon for themselves, you think, oh my gosh, this is awesome. And then when they cut their chicken for the first time, you're like, oh, yes, I can eat my meal now. There's something greater out there. I remember one of the other things as a parent that I was so excited about that was so much greater for my son was he could go to the bathroom by himself. I know we've got some parents in here right now that are potty training. I know Jamie and Allison, because Allison keeps posting pictures of their son naked on Facebook. He will hate y'all one day for that. But I'll never forget. One day I'm outside working in the yard. It was in the summer. And my son walks out on the back porch, and he's little, small, and he's standing there in nothing but his diaper. And apparently at some point along the way, he had saw his dad use the bathroom outside at one point or another. We lived in Williamston. It's kind of like a non-mountainous version of Pickens. And so I think that it's okay to use the bathroom outside if no one's looking, or if at least you get behind a tree or something. And so apparently he had seen his dad use the bathroom at some point. And so he looks at me, and I'm out in the yard, and he's up on the porch. He said, Daddy. And I said, yeah. He said, Isaac, TT. He talked to himself in third person. But anyway, he said, Isaac, TT. And I said, okay, son, go ahead, TT. He said, no diaper, Daddy. Isaac, TT. And I said, go ahead. And we had this porch, and it was about 10 feet off the ground. And he went over to the edge. And it was like I had taken him to like Toys R Us and bought him every toy in the toy store. He was the happiest thing. You know. And after a while, I said, you know what, we're going to make this a lesson. We're going to prepare him for something greater. And so I got his big blue plastic swimming pool, and I said, son, hit the pool. Then he went to a trash can. And then after he could write his name, he got to go inside. I'm just saying, for y'all that don't have boys, 5-year-old boys, 4-year-old, they just want to write their name. If they can write their name. But I was preparing him for something greater. Some of y'all that didn't have boys, you just missed out on that part right there. Some of the ladies are saying, you know what, some parents failed the job. They still can't lift the lid up and put the lid back down. But see, as a parent, we're what? We're preparing them. We're preparing them for something better along the way. And you see right here in the life of Joseph, at the point when he was knocked down, at a moment in his life where it looked like God had completely and totally forsaken him. He had been doing exactly what his father had told him to do. He was being obedient. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He found himself first sold into slavery, and not only sold into slavery, but he had been shipped off to a foreign country where he didn't know the language, didn't know the culture. And in the moment when it seemed the darkest, like no one cared, that he should just throw in the towel, he should give up hope, verse 2 tells us the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. And he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Joseph found favor in his eyes and he became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of this household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. Awesome to think that even in the midst of our setbacks and the times that we've been knocked down, in those moments when our natural gut instinct is to think, you know what, God's forsaken me, he's left me here to die. The Bible tells us that God wasn't finished, but instead God was preparing him for something that was still to come. Now we skip on down and it tells us right here in verse 6, it says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. Joseph was well built and handsome. Now, I was trying to think to myself, I don't normally go out and scope out guys and say, oh, that's a handsome dude or anything like that. And so I thought, okay, if I had to imagine Joseph in my mind, and I'm not saying this is what he looked like, but based on my Facebook feed, whenever the CMA awards are on, apparently Keith Urban is that guy because it's like all the girls that I'm friends with on Facebook, they'll put Keith Urban, exclamation, 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 or Dirk Bentley or something like that. But I thought about it, Keith Urban. He is like, he's a good-looking dude. I'm strong enough in my masculinity to just say that. He's got the country music thing going there. He looks good. He can sing country. And probably the best thing in all is he talks Australian. I mean, you could take any, I asked the first service this. Crystal, did Brian ever talk Australian? Because I'm trying to figure this out while you're with him. Because, I'm not saying he's an ugly dude. But you can take an ugly dude and they can talk Australian and suddenly girls are like, oh, he talks Australian, he's amazing. He probably surfs too. And so, I'm just kidding. I had to make fun at least one more time. So it says right here that Joseph was a good-looking guy. It says he was well-built and handsome. I need y'all back up here. The ladies right now, y'all are thinking Keith Urban. Stop. Okay, stop. Okay. It says he was a well-built and handsome guy, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. Come to bed with me. You see, Joseph's master's wife took a notice in Joseph. And despite the fact that he had done nothing wrong, he was just doing his job, the thing that he was supposed to do, he suddenly finds himself in a point of temptation. As a matter of fact, she comes to him repeatedly and says, lie with me, lie with me, lie with me. And finally, Joseph gets to the point and he says the following. He says, my master has withheld nothing from me except you because you are his wife. He was doing what he was supposed to do. He said, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He didn't want to lose the trust of his master, but more importantly, he did not want to disobey God. And you see, sometimes in life, we're going through life, we're doing what we are supposed to do, we're doing what we feel like God is leading us to do, and then all of a sudden, we have this setback, we get knocked down, and we begin to look around and say, why is this happening? What's going on here? But it says that day after day she came to him and said, lie with me. The Bible goes on to tell us that one day he came into the house doing his chores, doing what it was that he was supposed to do, not doing anything wrong. And it says that she caught him. She caught him. She grabbed him, and the Bible tells us that he ran out. And as they ran out, she grabbed his cloak and held on to that. And as soon as he got out of the house, she ran out and started screaming, rape. I've been raped. It tells us right here, it says she kept his cloak beside her until her master came home. Then she told him the story. She said, that Hebrew slave that you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and he ran out of the house. He ran out of the house. You see, here's the thing. If you were a slave in those times, you did not have rights. If you were accused, simply accused of rape, it wasn't like our justice system now where you get a trial by jury, you get lawyers and all kind of stuff like that. If you were a slave, you had absolutely zero rights. If you were accused of rape, the sentence was death. No bones about it. They didn't sit around to wait for a trial because, see, your word was no good. You had zero rights. And so it tells us right here that Joseph has been accused of rape by Potiphar's wife. He's been knocked down once again. And it says, when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. He burned with anger. Now, later on in the story, we're going to see that many scholars believe that his anger wasn't necessarily at Joseph, but in fact was more likely directed against his wife. And the reason scholars think that is because Joseph wasn't immediately put to death, but instead it tells us that he was taken to prison. More than likely, Potiphar knew his wife's ways. He knew how cunning and deceptive that she possibly was. But you know what? In that culture, he had to save face. He couldn't simply let Joseph go scot-free. So it says, Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. King's prison was kind of interesting because in the king's prison, there were two ways to get out. Number one, your sentence could be commuted by the king himself, or number two, you died. It was either through execution or you simply rotted in jail. You stayed there until you died. There was two ways to get out of the king's prison. And most of the time, there wasn't going to be a commutation. They weren't going to commute your sentence. It was going to be a situation where you sat there and you died in jail. And so here we see Joseph. It says, when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison. Now, if only they had had social media back then. I could just imagine it right now. Joseph gets thrown in prison. He pulls out his cell phone. He checks in on Foursquare, King's Prison. Then he takes a selfie with him and the guard. He's like, yeah, hanging out, yeah, you know. And then he types in his Facebook status, and it says, "Ugh, porridge again for breakfast. SMH, shaking my head." Facebook is depressing. I don't know if y'all have like depressing posts. I don't follow you. If you have depressing posts, I'll read like 3 statuses and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's people's lives this bad every single day. But I look at that and I say, you know what would he have done right there? You see, would he begin to question? I think many of us would. I can remember when Isaac was about 9 years old, he had his liver transplant. For some of y'all that don't know the story, he had a liver transplant when he was 3. He had a bone marrow transplant when he was 8 years old. And we would go back and forth to Cincinnati, Ohio for his checkups for his doctors. We had to go up there every other week for about 6 months to a year. And we're riding up the road one day. We're in the mountains of Tennessee on our way up to Cincinnati. And he said, "Daddy, I got to ask you a question." And usually when we're riding up the road, if he asked me a question, it was, you know, we're going to stop and get something to eat soon, or I got to go to the bathroom, something like that. And I just expected a normal question. And Isaac, from the back seat, he says, "Daddy," he says, "I'm not questioning God." This is a 9-year-old giving me a theology lesson. He said, I'm not questioning God. He said, "But sometimes I wonder, why me?" I didn't have an answer. Sometimes I wonder, why me? And see, you may very well be in that situation right now in your life, in a relationship with your family, in a job situation where you've done all the right things. You've done what you thought you were supposed to do. And you find yourself asking that question, why me? I haven't done anything bad. I mean, there's a lot of bad people in the world that have done a lot of bad things, and look at them, they're getting off scot-free. But yet I'm trying to do what you've called me to do. God, why me? You see, that's what we see happening right here with Joseph. It says, his master took him and put him in the king's prison. He'd been knocked down again, and he had the choice to make. He could sit back, or he could begin to look to see how God was preparing him for a comeback. You see, the preparation process is not fun. Heard a guy say one time, he who God uses greatly, he first prepares greatly. And few are the men that can withstand that preparation. And I thought about that. I was like, man, that's true. But see, there's a preparation, and sometimes that preparation that God allows us to go through isn't necessarily fun. Sometimes it hurts. It can be painful. See, I'm not big on the latest workout crazes and stuff like that. I don't get into a lot of the stuff that's out there. Like years ago, there was Tybo. Anybody remember Tybo? Anybody do Tybo that you want to admit? You don't have to put it, Andrew. Man, I'm sorry. I will not look at you the same. Tybo, and then there was P90X, and P90X. Those people thought they were cool. And then now there's this one called CrossFit. Not going to point out anybody in here doing that. And I've often thought, it would be awesome if they came up with like a workout system that gave you like some real life skills. And I told my wife, I said, I'm going to come out with something called like real life workout. And you go and you learn how to do post hole digging, change tires on cars, harness a donkey with a plow or something that could be useful at some point in life. But instead, you get this thing called Frankenstein. We used to call that toe touches, but apparently it sounds cooler as Frankenstein. And they do something called burpees, and we call those up downs in football. But anyways, with this, Brian and I were talking earlier this morning, and I asked him, I said, have you got to the point where you get to do the tractor tire flip? That's the one you see. Real life workout would give you some useful skills. CrossFit gives you some great Facebook status updates. Okay, but anyway, I thought, if I said, have you got to the tractor tire flip? Because everybody at some point in their life is going to be faced when you're riding down the road, and there's going to be a tractor in the road, tractor tire in the road. You're like, I need to get out and move this. Step aside. CrossFit Pickens representing. Burpee, burpee, burpee. Woo! But Brian was telling me. I did donut lift this morning. Donut lift. But we were talking about the tractor tire lift. Where was I? But I asked him. Well, I didn't have to ask him. I saw his Facebook post. But anyway, I said, the first time you went in there, what happened? You wanted to hurl, right? Because it was tough. I mean, I understand. I have respect for CrossFit. I have heard that it is tough. And so he said, yeah, the first time I wanted to hurl. And then the second time, still wanted to hurl. But then over time, what happened? As painful as it was, the first time you told me something about you didn't feel like you could get out of the bed the next morning or something like that. Reese and Crystal and Brinkley had all drug you to the shower or something along those lines. But anyway, over time, what happens? Even though it's painful, some of the things that you're going through, over time, what happens? Your body begins to build up. Your body begins to get adjusted because there's a strengthening that takes place. Even in the midst of all that pain that you're going through, even with Tybo, Zumba. If you did that, dude, you're out. But even in the midst of that pain, through that workout, what happens is your body begins to get strengthened. You begin to get stronger. And your body, the next time you go out, doesn't hurt quite as bad. You want to hurl a little bit less. And then over time, less and less and less. And finally, your body has begun to build up because of that. And I believe that this is the same thing that happens when it comes to our faith. As we experience those setbacks, when we've been knocked down to the ground, I believe that what God is really doing in those moments in our life is God is beginning to strengthen our character. Because even though Joseph may have questioned in his mind what God was doing, he never turned his back on God. He remained faithful no matter what the situation, no matter what was happening, what was going on in his life. As God began to allow him to go through these moments, these trials, these tribulations, these struggles, what we can see happening in the life of Joseph, and we're going to see in just a minute, was God was beginning to prepare him for something greater that he had in store for him. And that's the same thing for all of us. And the greater thing, what we talked about earlier, is that our lives would be a reflection of God. But you see, he has to take us through those moments in life to allow us to get to that point. And so the story continues on, and it says that he threw him in the prison. But check out again, it says, but while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was what? The Lord was what? The Lord was with him. Even in the midst of a severe trial, I can't imagine being thrown into prison, especially for something that you did not do. But yet it says the Lord was with him. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. In the midst of the trial that he was facing, God was still faithful. God was still preparing him for what was yet to come. In chapter 40, it tells us sometimes later, there were two guys that were thrown into prison. There was the baker and there was the cupbearer. Apparently, Pharaoh had gotten upset with these people because scholars believe that there was most likely an attempt on Pharaoh's life. And the way that they would kill someone back then, if you were trying to kill the king, is a lot of times you would poison the king. And so the cupbearer was the guy that tasted all the drink and all the food for the king. So if you were going to poison the king, you'd have to have the cupbearer in on it, or you would have to have the baker in on it because he was the one that was going to be making the food to start with. And so here these two guys, they get thrown into prison, but because it says that the Lord was with Joseph, what happens? The jailer puts Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. He's in charge of all the prisoners, and so one day he goes in to care for these two prisoners. He's in prison, but yet he's still faithful. He's still doing what it is that he believes he's called to do. He's taking care of these two guys. He walks in one day, and it says that they were sad. He asked him, he said, "Why are you guys sad?" And they said, "Well, we've had a dream, but there's no one here to interpret that dream." And so Joseph says, "Hey, tell me what your dream is. I'll allow God to interpret it for you." And so the first guy says, the cupbearer says, there was this dream, there's some grapes. I was back with Pharaoh again. Joseph said, here's the interpretation. In 3 days, you're going to be lifted up and restored to your former position. And then Joseph tells him right here, in verse 14 of chapter 40, it says, but when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh. Now, this next little part right here is probably one of the best parts in this whole story because I believe that it really shows the humanity of Joseph. You see, many times when I read stories in the Bible, I know I have in the past when I've read something and I'll look and I'll see these guys in the Bible and I'll say, how was their faith so strong? I feel like a total loser. When I read this, I think, they weren't even thinking like real human thoughts at that point. How did they do that? There wasn't any humanity there. But notice what it says next. It says, mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. Get me out of this prison. You say, you know what? I don't want to be here. And maybe you felt that in a situation in your life before. You just said, you know what? Get me out of here. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in this place in my life. God, please. And so he continues on, and the baker told him his story. And Joseph said, well, here's the outcome of your story. He said, you're going to be lifted up in 3 days too, but it's not in the way that you want to. The king's going to execute you. You're going to get out of prison, but not in a happy way. And so the Bible tells us that just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation, it happened. Exactly what he said to them in his interpretation, it happened. And then here is probably one of the biggest body blows. Joseph just has told the cupbearer, he said, you know what, you're going to be out of prison. There's this little bit of hope there. He said, when you get out of prison, remember me, mention me to Pharaoh. And some of you have probably reached that point in your life where you've had like a little inkling of hope and you're thinking things are about to turn the corner. And in Joseph's life, that was the case right there. It says that the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Back down to the mat he goes. He's been knocked down once again. He's faced another setback, and at that point in time, he had a decision to make. He said, you know what? I can sit back, I can throw in the towel, or I can continue to allow God to prepare me for a comeback. Over in chapter 41, it tells us that 2 years later, the cupbearer had forgotten about him for 2 years. All total, from the time he first went into prison, 13 years. 13 years he had been living this nightmare. Some of you maybe have been through that same situation. You've been living with something for years and years and years that you've struggled with, that you've thought in your mind, you know what, I should just give up. I've tried, I quit. See, we're impatient people. Think about it. We want things to happen right then. We want God to answer our prayers at that moment. You see, what happens many times is those prayers get answered, but it may be on down the line when we can kind of handle those things. You know? If we kind of knew right now what we would know in the future, sometimes it kind of blow our mind. But you see, we're impatient. We live in an impatient society. We can't wait more than 3 cars at McDonald's. You know, if there's more than 3 cars, we can drive next door to Taco Bell, as bad as that is. We don't want to wait. And many times that's the same way with God. We don't want to wait. But yet it tells us right there, 2 full years passed. 2 full years passed. 13 years total. Pharaoh has a dream. Cupbearer goes, oh yeah, there was this guy I met in prison. You remember? He threw me in prison a few years ago. I met this guy. He can interpret dreams. Pharaoh says, go get him. They bring Joseph before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked him, he said, I hear that you can interpret dreams. This is his moment to get out of jail. And Joseph says, nope, can't do it. That was his moment. He says, but God can. You see, even in the midst of his trial and tribulation, Joseph understood who really was at work in his life. It wasn't anything that he was doing of his own, but it was a process in which God was preparing him for something greater. The Bible tells us he interpreted the dream. He said, you know what, there's going to be some great years where we're going to have an extra harvest, and then he said there's going to be some lean years. There's going to be some times that we're going to struggle. And then check out what Pharaoh says right here in chapter 41 in verse 38. It says, so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? One in whom is the Spirit of God. A 13-year overnight success. The Bible tells us that Pharaoh elevated him to number 2 man in all the land. Back in those times, that would have been equivalent to being the second most powerful person on the face of the earth. Where just a short time earlier, he had been rotten in the king's prison. But you see, he never would have gotten to that point where he was the second most powerful person in all the world if he had first not met the cupbearer. If he had not first met the cupbearer, he would have never met the cupbearer if he hadn't first been thrown into the prison. He never would have been thrown into the prison if he hadn't been falsely accused of rape by his master's wife. He never would have been accused of rape by his master's wife if he hadn't been first sold to Potiphar. He wouldn't have been sold to Potiphar if he hadn't been sold to the Midianites by his brothers. See, there was a preparation process that was taking place. You see, slowly along the way, we see this Joseph, who was an arrogant kid, telling his brothers that everybody was going to bow down to him, top of the world, to suddenly God was giving him some humility. I don't think there would be a more humbling thing than to be sold into slavery. He went from this pedestal up here, so suddenly he's experienced humility, and not only during that process did he experience humility, but we notice in the story with Potiphar, he begins to develop these leadership abilities. God puts him in charge of a household. Then he goes from being in charge of a household to prison, where God puts him in charge of the entire prison population, till finally this preparation that God had started comes full bloom, and he's in charge of a nation. You see, there was a preparation in his life. He could have given up. He could have thrown in the towel. He could have allowed his setback to cause him to sit back. But instead, he allowed God to prepare him for the comeback. I don't know where you're at right now in your life. I don't know what it is that you're facing. We all face setbacks in different forms and fashions. You may be at that point where you thought about throwing in the towel. But as you begin to consider that, just ask this question: could it possibly be that God is preparing me to display his glory through my life? Could he really just be setting me up for a comeback? But I've got to allow this preparation to take place in my life. Let's pray. God, in life, we all experience setbacks. We all experience those moments where we've been knocked down. We experience times when things don't necessarily go our way. Those times when we want to throw our hands up in the air and say, God, why me? Why is this happening to me? What are you doing? What are you trying to accomplish here? But God, we also know that you're a faithful God. Your word tells us that you'll never leave us, you'll never forsake us. And we see evidence of that in the life of Joseph. We see that despite the many setbacks he faced, despite the many times that he was knocked down to the mat, we see time and time again in your word that you were with him. And so, God, this morning I pray right now that we would be encouraged as we look at the life of Joseph, and God, that we would turn to you and look to you and say, God, what are you preparing me for? God, I want to be in the middle of your will, and I know that it's going to be tough. I know it could be painful, but in the end, I want to display your glory in my life. God, we thank you for all you do. In Christ's name I pray.